me, what's going on for you and how could I help?
Yes, so I have a few questions, mainly logical reasoning focused and a few reading comprehension because I spent most of my time studying the logic games, and now I just kind of wrapped up the logical reasoning part in my study schedule, and I'm about to start the reading comprehension part. So, I guess to start, maybe some of the logical reasoning questions.
Yeah, sure. Shoot.
So, yeah, so I guess just a general question that I've been running into is, and I'm sure a lot of people have this problem when you're down between two questions, or maybe it might be, or two question choices, and or maybe multiple, and just how to really narrow it down and to at what point to decide which one's wrong. Um, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. This
Okay.
is a very common issue, down to two, picking the wrong one. And first off,
Hmm.
I want to say that sometimes you're down to two and you pick the right one. And so
Right.
there's a certain selection effect there. You don't always pick the wrong one, which is something a lot of people raise as an issue, not necessarily you in particular, but one thing that might have come to mind. But when you're down to two, there's the strength of the language to consider.
Okay.
So certain types you're looking for stronger language, certain times you're looking for weaker language. Do you feel like you have a handle on when to be looking for what?
Um, at times, I think for certain question types, yes. So if I'm doing like a necessary assumption, then I know, okay, um, certain language. Wait, yeah, that's the one where it's like if it's too extreme, that's not the right answer. So I kind of like can get a good gauge on that, but some are a little more ambiguous for me.
Okay, so necessary assumption, as you said, extreme language, not the way to go. More moderate language is what you're looking for there. So
Right.
that's a decision point, necessary assumption, down to two, leaning one way versus leaning the other way.
Okay.
And then other types, it may be, the calculus may be different. So in sufficient assumption, for example, strong language is a great way to go. It could be as strong as you want, as long as it gets the job done. So you may not want something as moderate in that context. This is not a hard and fast rule. Everything depends on the specifics, but this could help you lean in one way versus leaning in the other way.
Okay. So really look at the language type. Okay, that makes sense. And something that did happen when I was going over principal questions. For the most part, I have a good handle on them. But I'm trying to remember the specific question, but the answer choices for one of the ones I was looking at, they were all very similar. And I realized that I picked the wrong answer because the language was like they had, it wasn't so much they made it extreme, but they had changed the wording where it didn't necessarily match the question, but the right answer kind of took almost verbatim. And I just was looking at um, context over the language at that point.
Mm-hmm. When you say context over language, what do you mean?
Well, it's taking more of what I thought the answer was saying in terms of, I'm really trying to remember what they were talking about.
You mean like the topic?
Yes, the topic. There you go. Thank you.
Gotcha. Sure. So the topic never matters. Topic
Okay.
never matters. It's the structure of the argument that matters. So
Okay.
in a parallel reasoning question or principal application, doesn't matter if the topic's the same. What matters is the substance in terms of how they go about making the argument. So the degrees of certainty and the categories of things they're discussing.
Okay.
Those are the two things you always want to look for in principal application and parallel reasoning: the degree of certainty and the category of things they're discussing. This to me is the core, and this relates also back to your question around being down to two. A lot of times two choices will be extremely similar, but one goes astray on degree of certainty or the category. Degree of certainty, you probably have a handle on what that means, like always, never, sometimes, most of the time.
Yes.
But category of things they're discussing is a little bit different.
Okay.
That would be like all people who take the LSAT versus all people who take the LSAT and also study properly. Studying
Okay.
properly is a further constraint or limitation or qualifying factor, limiting who we're talking about. And so you want to see how closely does it need to match. And then you have incorrect answers that would limit it in some way that don't really matter or are relevant. Like all people who take the LSAT and are also vegetarian. Vegetarian would be an irrelevant factor in that example potentially, but still limiting it in a way that doesn't matter.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, that actually clears up a lot, because I feel like I have been getting, I guess, a little sidetracked with the topic and getting bogged down by those details. And that's like something I was vaguely aware of, but I wasn't really sure where my mistake was coming from. So that makes sense.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Of course, glad to help.
I'm trying to look at my other questions. Sorry, I wrote like a list.
Yeah,
so I'm just
go right
scanning
ahead.
through. Okay. Part of, would you be able to go over just negating conditional statements? Because I feel like I've read your articles, I watched your video, but putting it into practice, it's still like a disconnect for me. I mean, I feel like it's something simple that I'm just maybe overcomplicating.
Yeah, totally. It's a confusing issue that comes up a lot. It actually is fairly straightforward to address it, but we could certainly talk through it. And the issue is that when we put things in if then, it becomes hard to know what do we convert from positive to negative.
Right.
So like X negated is not X. Y negated is not Y. But if X then Y, we're like, are we negating the X? Are we negating the Y? Hard to say. And so I would say translate it away from being an if then conditional. So we could say instead of if X then Y, we could say X requires Y.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
So then if we have X requires Y, the negation would be to negate the verb itself. So how might you go about that? Any ideas?
Okay, negate the verb itself. Did you want it just negate? Would you just go ahead and negate? You're not going to negate Y. You're going to say X does not require Y. Well, yeah, then you would be negating Y. Yeah.
No, you got it. You're perfect. And I put you on the spot and you still got it, which is awesome. And I don't like to do that unless I think you can do it, but I knew you could. So you're good, of course. So X requires Y becomes X does not require Y. We negate the verb. That is the way to get the logical opposite of that statement.
Okay, that makes sense.
Cool. So it really can be as simple as that. So if you were drawing it out, you have X arrow Y, you're putting a slash through the arrow. That's how I would illustrate that or diagram it, even though this doesn't really come up in logic games. This is more of a logical reasoning thing.
Yeah.
They're also and they're also never asking you to negate something, but this could come up in, for example, necessary assumption questions if you're trying to negate all 5 choices.
Okay, that actually helps a lot. Yeah, big part. I don't know why it's the necessary assumption and the sufficient assumption that just throws me off for some reason. And I find that not so much I mix them up, but they're both like equally the harder ones for me.
Yeah, they're a common issue. First of all, just simply telling the difference and then knowing how to approach each, because they are common, they are difficult, and they're completely different in terms of approach.
Right. Okay. So going on. Oh, I do have another question with logical reasoning. So going through some of your videos, I note one of the strategies you talk about is diagramming certain logical reasoning questions, but not all of them. And I guess my question is just when would that be necessary? And is that something that you should do if, like, say you run into a hard problem, but you're running out of time and diagramming would help you solve it? Should you go ahead and diagram that? Should you skip it? Or different tips on that?
Great question. So diagramming, I think most students tend to diagram far too much.
Okay.
I would diagram very little in logical reasoning, only on certain specific question types.
Okay.
So those types would be sufficient assumption a lot of the time,
Okay.
parallel reasoning sometimes, and must be true questions and other inference questions sometimes. That's it. Logical reasoning is much more informal logic where you are really engaging with the arguments in a real world sense. But for certain particular types that are more formal logic style in nature, it could be useful. But diagramming is not a substitute for thinking or for engaging with the argument. And there are really, like I said, very limited cases where it's useful. And that's where it's more technically worded, the way that a normal person would never talk. Lots of conditionals are a good indicator that you might want to go in that direction. And then you'll see, of course, in the course, I've got the formulas for sufficient assumption questions. So that's a unique category where diagramming is often a valuable technique, but I wouldn't resort to it all the time.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, perfect. Because I don't normally diagram, so it's like, ooh, should I be doing that more? But good to know that it's 3 types, so that I'll try practicing that when I run into that issue.
Yeah, of course. And if you're saying like, I don't diagram much, should I diagram more? The answer is probably not. Typically people diagram too much and I have to move them away from that because some other companies out there, they'll suggest diagramming all the time. And I come across students who are trying to diagram a necessary assumption question where that's not really useful at all. They're just essentially summarizing all the proper nouns in the stimulus with letters, but that's not really getting you anywhere. It gets you somewhere when you're taking the contrapositive or linking things together. If you're not doing that, it's probably not going to help you.
Okay, that's good to know. Great. Then I'll keep doing what I'm doing, but look for opportunities to diagram, I think.
Awesome. Cool. Anything else for today?
Yes, if we still have
time, sure,
I guess
totally.
Just my last one would be starting the reading comprehension section. That's an area that I've never really known how to study, and I just and you cover this in like your introduction video about how everyone can improve, but I'm just trying to figure out what your different tips on are for improving besides maybe increasing your pacing.
Yeah, sure. I don't want to talk in too many general terms just because you've already got that in the course.
Right.
But doing actual passages and extracting the main idea as an exercise. If you're just looking to get started, can you read a passage and walk away simply with the main idea?
Okay.
People talk about reading external sources like the Scientific American, The Economist, and all that. And that's a nice thing to do, but you've got nearly 400 reading comp passages available to you. I would focus on those if you can. I would say you could read those magazines on your commute, but very few people are commuting these days. So you might as well just use the actual LSAT exams.
Yeah, my commute's to my door, so.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's a great, I've never actually considered just reading the passage on itself and looking for the main point. So that's a really good tip. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Awesome, Jen. Well,
yeah.
I'm glad we connected. What would you say is the biggest insight you got from our call today?
Oh my goodness, so many things. I think probably for me, just the whole how to narrow down your answer choices and really not to get bogged into the topic of the question as you were talking about. And the second thing would probably be your little tip about diagramming, because that gave me peace that I don't really have to go through and diagram more. But everything you said was very helpful, and I'm definitely taking it all away. So thank you.
Of course. Glad to help, Jen. Keep in touch, and I'll see you in class soon.
Sounds good. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.